All right, welcome back, everyone. We are reconvened for the long-range plan discussion for 2014-2015. This is the first of several meetings
It is.
that will take place on this topic. So disregard the horrendous weather outside and come with us on a journey through the long-range plan. Mr. Fieldman.
Welcome to the long-range plan for this year. The village, of course, has a long history of strategic and financial planning. It's served us well. We've achieved many financial sustainability goals. We've achieved many strategic goals. In 2013, we combined long-range financial planning with strategic planning so that we're both focused on outcomes, strategic, and financial, which is resource allocation driven. We now identify issues affecting the village now that may also affect us in the future. We develop strategies to address those issues over the long haul. This planning document guides our annual budget preparation, but we shouldn't overlook that it actually also guides daily operations, and staff refers to it on a regular basis. It also includes action items over a 2-year period. What we're doing here is actually an update to the 2013-2015 plan, and we have 3 objectives. Review the 3 key issues that are included in the current plan. Let's see how we're doing on those. Identify and address new trends and issues that affect the future of the village. And the third is to review and modify, if necessary, the high and medium priority action items included in the current plan. As the mayor mentioned, we have a series of meetings planned over the summer. Here is the schedule. Here we are at May 20th. We have 1 meeting per month planned through August to address these issues. For tonight, we want to start with an overview of the current 2013 to 2015 long-range plan. The plan contains 5 goals. These goals that you see here on the screen have remained largely unchanged over the past several years. In fact, they have served us very well. We have achieved significant results supporting all of these goals. The results are many, really too many to go through here tonight. The best place to get an idea of where and how we've achieved these goals is to go back and review our annual reports, really starting in 2010. And if you read them in succession, they're quick reads, you get a great story of measurable items that we've achieved pursuant to these goals. The current plan has identified 3 key issues with strategies to address them. These are the ones that we talked about last year. And tonight we want to provide an update on all 3 of these items: the infrastructure and maintenance gap, facilities planning and sustainability, and the potential reduction of state shared revenues. You remember from last year we had an annual maintenance gap where revenues would not reach the expenses required to properly maintain our infrastructure systems, particularly our street system. We were about $1.2 million per year short. We did identify a strategy for addressing that, and that would be to take existing revenues we currently have in place in the form of home rule sales tax and property tax that were originally targeted for the retirement of a bond issuance and stormwater-related expenses, move those over to pledge them to street maintenance and other infrastructure maintenance gaps. So this is a $1.2 million gap with a $1.2 million solution. You will see that shift in existing revenues reflected in the 2015 budget, so we are on target to addressing this issue. The second issue is facilities sustainability. This is actually an action item we're currently working on. The council had a meeting on this just a few weeks ago. The issue here is our police station and village hall requirement major renovations. Council is currently pursuing 2 options. We will meet again in the coming months, and by August we expect to have council direction on this high priority action item. The third key issue identified in the current plan that we talked about last year is the potential reduction in state shared revenues, primarily income tax. This is often also referred to as LGDF, Local Government Distributed Fund, that was discussed earlier in the council meeting portion of tonight. There is a risk that the state General Assembly may take actions that could reduce the amount of money coming to not only our municipality but all municipalities. The actions we put in place to address this potential loss of revenue are to continue to maintain substantial reserves and continue to monitor state actions while working to protect municipal revenues. In the event that we have a significant loss in revenue, we would engage in a prioritization discussion and potential restructuring effort similar to that of what we have done in 2010 when we experienced the impact of the Great Recession. The key here is to position ourselves well to be able to be sustainable while we go about any prioritization and restructuring effort. And you'll hear later tonight and see that we are very well positioned to address any of these issues in the short run, allowing us time to restructure if necessary. Before I go on to the identification of key issues and solutions for this round of planning and the update, does the council have any questions about the three key issues and actions to date?
No, sir.
What do you, how do you see this procedurally? You're just going to kind of roll through this tonight, and then we'll start formulating topics with which we might discuss. I'm trying to not pull the same thing as the zoning thing and screw this up by waiting till the end.
Yeah. Yes. Procedurally, you know what, that's probably a good transition into the very next slide.
Right, because we're focusing on certain issues tonight, such as,
So we have 4 meetings planned. Tonight, what we want to do is go through some issues related to the general fund revenues and our fund balance, and really set up for a discussion at the next meeting about the risk fund and some strategies and issues we have there, moving on to downtown TIF discussion the same evening. The risk fund discussion, downtown TIF discussion would happen at the June meeting. And Commissioner, to your point, I think that would be a good point to start a discussion about specific solutions to the issues we've identified. Those 3 issues are all related, and you'll see as I go through the slides tonight, they relate to how to best put our money to work, the fund balance we've accumulated in the general fund. In the July meeting, we'll take a look at stormwater utility revenue needs. What we'll do is go through, take a look at our revenues, our expenses, and make sure we're all on the same page as our plan for adjustments to stormwater utility fees going forward. So we expect that to be a very interactive meeting among the council looking for direction on a plan. And then the last meeting in August would be an update to any of our action items for the balance of this makeup of the current council. So this meeting is probably more informational. The June meeting would be participative, looking for council direction on use of fund balance in the general fund. The next meeting would be participative, looking for direction on setting utility rates. And certainly August would be participative, looking for direction on our action items. The first issue concerns the general fund. The village has existing financial needs in many areas, and we've been talking about them for several years. We have demonstrated these needs, we've quantified these needs in past long-range planning efforts, and we're going to do it again in this long-range planning session. We have some great news, though. The performance of our general fund, which is our main operating fund, over the past few years has been absolutely exceptional. Because of this exceptional performance, we have accumulated a pretty large fund balance that exceeds our village's fund balance policy. This graph really does show it all, Mayor, as you were saying as we entered the room. This is a graph showing revenues and expenses in the general fund from 2007 through 2013. Revenues are shown on the blue line. Expenses are shown on the orange or red line. What this graph shows you is that revenues have exceeded expenses every year since 2010. Revenues are performing better than our annual budget projections, and expenses have been controlled. During this time, while that blue line of revenues is above the red line of expenses, our fund balance, the amount of money we have in our operating fund, has grown from $15.4 million in 2009 to over $21 million now. We want to take a closer look at general fund revenues since 2009, and that's what this graph shows. And really the best place to get a detailed understanding is in the printed copies or the version online if you have a tablet or a computer. What this series of stacked bar graphs shows is that total revenues in the general fund have increased by 12% since 2009. 12% since 2009, an average increase of 2.9% per year. The key drivers of this revenue performance are income tax, sales tax revenue, and building permit revenue. So those are the three key drivers: income tax, sales tax, and building permit revenue. This is a graph taking a closer look at general fund expenses. We have some great news on this front. Expenses have increased by only 5.92% in total since 2009. That's an average increase of less than 1.5% per year. I should note that stormwater expenses were shifted to another fund, the Stormwater Fund, in 2013, which accounts for some of the expense control. That was really more of a shift than a reduction. However, we have done a great job of controlling expenses. You look at the three components of this bar graph. The blue section at the bottom represents salary and wages, and then the yellowish section in the middle is pension expenses, and the top section is all other expenses in the general fund. What we're saying here is personnel expenses have increased at a rate of about 2.5% a year. Salary and wages, the biggest component of that, have increased at only 2.9% in the past 4 years, less than 1% a year. Personnel expenses of salaries and wages have increased at less than 1% a year. A lot of this has to do with our staffing reductions, which took place in 2010, and we continued to control staffing levels. I do want to point out on this graph that pension expenses during this time have increased 44.3%. 44.3%, an average of 11% per year. Look at the stark contrast. You remember that the pension expenses largely are determined by benefit levels controlled by the state, and our inputs are really limited to how many people we employ and what we pay them. So the areas we control directly, we have a great story of cost containment, cost control. The pension area, you can see that increase is far outpacing other controllable expenses here at the village. I want to talk a little bit about our bond rating and how it relates to our policy discussion. A bond rating is a very strong measure of an organization's overall financial condition and performance. The village has achieved the highest bond rating possible, AAA, as rated by Standards & Poor's. The importance of this great bond rating is that this rating allows us to borrow money at a lower cost, which means we put more of our money to work directly into infrastructure projects for which we issue bonds. More of our money goes directly into the actual infrastructure than into interest payments. This rating was the product of exceptional municipal management and financial stewardship, and the bullet points on the screen were taken right out of the S&P report reflecting those two ideas. Why do we mention this? Obviously, with those benefits of a AAA rating, the village should strive to maintain that AAA bond rating. But at the same time, we should try to make sure that we are maximizing the value and utility of the money we have in our fund balance. Put that money to work. So here, in a nutshell, really, is our issue. When you read the S&P report in some detail, that report suggests that we should keep about $16.6 million in our fund balance to be in a position to keep that AAA rating. So about $16.6 million should be kept there. $20.4 million is available now on our general fund balance. That means that we have $3.8 million available for those existing quantified and demonstrated needs elsewhere in the village. So the idea is keep enough money in there to maintain the AAA rating and the benefits that come with it, and then anything above that, let's put it to work for us in areas that we have needs. We have some recommendations as to how we could use some of this money. The first recommendation actually has a number in it, and that is we should transfer $1.9 million to the transportation fund. We recommend that this be transferred because we have an accumulated deficit in this fund that was the product of multiple years of operating deficits for the Grove Commuter Shuttle. We are no longer increasing the accumulated deficit because of partnerships and agreements we have with PACE. We are operating at a break even or better. But when you read that S&P report in our bond rating, because we have that negative accumulated deficit, they've already counted that money against us as not available and not calculated towards that bond rating. This suggests that we should go ahead and make that transfer in its entirety to eliminate that accumulated deficit. You'll see next here on the slide that we have some blanks here that we would like the council and the community to help us fill out as part of long-range planning this year. We think we should keep some amount, perhaps above that 16.6 million, in the general fund balance or reserves to be positioned to address any reduction in state shared revenues. We also think that we should transfer some money to address issues in the risk fund and transfer some of that money potentially to address some downtown TIF debt service payments. It's important to note at the next meeting, we will go through in some detail the issues that we face in risk management and those cost issues and downtown TIF. So at the end of the next presentation by staff at the next meeting, you should be in a position to weigh in on what we should do and how we should distribute those funds. And that's what this slide entails. The next step is that discussion. At the end of that meeting, I see a discussion amongst us how to best allocate $1.9 million of fund balance. With that, Mayor, we're happy to answer any comments, questions. We have a lot of the staff that put this long-range plan presentation together here with us tonight.
I'll give the audience a chance to collect their thoughts and ask members of the council if they have any questions or comments on what's been presented thus far, underscoring the sequencing that was described earlier. And you're really looking for more input in terms of answers to some of the questions that have been posed, as well as any other suggestions in terms of what we might be doing in this area at the next meeting.
Correct.
But not to foreclose anyone from bringing up anything now. I will remind everyone, so we don't end up at the end where we have a big conversation, sort of a balloon payment, like if something does come up, there's no reason why it can't be stated now, and then we'll know it's on the table for next time, even if that's when the discussion takes place. So with that introduction, any questions or comments from the council at this point in time?
Yeah.
I do, so go ahead.
You can start if you
No,
like.
go ahead, all for you. Go for it.
I'd like us to try and think about two things and try and develop some planning for a couple things. I guess I want to change that, for the purposes of this consideration of this group and the discussion tonight and on the 17th, I'd like us to take that 1.9 million transportation fund and make that a blank line like the others. Because that that $1.9 million, it's sort of already out there, it's sort of already discounted certainly as an internal debt because of the way we do our fund accounting, but it need not necessarily be retired. We have a system in place for, a year and a half, 2 years, trying to deal with interest and chip that away. Because it's a debt to ourselves, and we all bring different experiences to the group, but cash flow is one that always makes me nervous. And I see other needs, and I think in my mind, some of the other elements on that list are bigger priorities to me. The other thing that I'd like us to do is try and think about developing a plan that takes, a decade, but moves us to a position where if we go back to, this chart, I'd like us to get to the point where, and I'm going to use real generic terms, but it's a long planning thing, not a flip of a switch thing, but where we saw LGDF as almost gravy, if you will. We weren't quite so heavily dependent on it. I mean, we're pretty heavily dependent on it right now. And if you look at the idea of trying to tie expenses and revenues together, these things, not that sales tax is any more predictable, but at least it's, at least it's a little bit more under control than LGDF in particular. These things, going back to the expense line, think some of you know I was asking some questions about trying to get behind some of the details behind, in particular, the $32 million and the $40 million for round numbers is stuff that the only way you change it is by either changing service levels or changing state law. And we need to have those conversations continually about what service levels are appropriate. But to Dave's point earlier, our numbers look as good as they do and our performance looks as good as it does by adjustments in personnel. So when we look at whatever $5 million out of number is of LGDF, which is at risk, we know it's in play. So let's, when was it, 69? When was it? Did they start? 70. So, for the first 125 years, the village operated without LGDF. And I'd just like us to be a little less dependent on them. And that's not a short conversation. I mean, I'm not sitting here tonight acting like I've got some suggestions on exactly how we do that, but I think we need to sort of identify that as a goal and start keeping that in the conversation for whatever other decisions we're making. Does that sort of further the goal of reducing our reliance on LGDF, or does it cement the need? Because that's a big deal. Not everybody probably shares the same attachment to some of the tough decisions that were made, but they were not any fun. And I want to stay way the heck away from having to make them again. And we're talking about under almost, I think, any reasonable scenario, incurring fairly hefty amount of additional debt from our facilities needs sometime in the pretty near future. And so I just want to be working towards getting off of the state if we can. We can't today, but working towards it. I'd like to have this kind of goal that we're always talking about. And I'm sorry I don't have that slide in front of me, but those four groups or those four possible uses to try and bring some of that general fund back down into the recommended range. Those are good, but I sort of encourage colleagues to think between now and next week about whether there's anything else that ought to be, from our vantage point, or 7 vantage points, if there's anything else that ought to be considered up there.
Commissioner, did I capture this right? Consider a long-term plan to reduce reliance on state shared revenues, align expenses with revenues while maintaining or enhancing service levels. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I would have taken sort of the last thing off there from while forward, just remove that. I think we need to have a pretty regular discussion about what service levels are, and I don't know that I'm comfortable saying maintain and enhance all the time.
Okay.
It's, not a good analogy, but needs of the community change too. And so, this is a horrible analogy, but it's the one popping into my head as I'm trying to figure out how to get hold of my kids. But, there's a lot of people not even putting in landlines anymore. So needs and expectations of the market change too. And so if we hold on to maintain and enhance, maintain maybe not, depends on sort of what the issue is. I don't want to put that idea into stone on anything. We do it a lot. We say it all over the place. Maintain and enhance, maintain and enhance. Yeah, but maybe not. Maybe dump. Dump and enhance something else maybe. Let's not get too locked into that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Other questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions?
I have a question. How much have we chipped away at that transportation fund deficit with the current plan?
I believe it's a couple $100,000 over the last 2 years.
Just a little under 100.
About 100.
Thank you.
It's still a pretty low interest rate environment.
Right.
Other questions? Waving pens? I can't tell if that's a hand.
No, I'm kind of waving the pen, contemplating.
All right.
Good word.
I think I tend to agree on the transportation fund issue, because the reality is, and no disrespect to our accountants in the room, that's kind of an accounting issue. It's more of a true deficit, and we need to remind ourselves of that. Yes, it's something we'd like just to not have on our books anymore, but it is sort of a debt to ourselves. It's like borrowing against your variable whole life policy. It's your own money that you've kind of borrowed out. And if we have more pressing needs, I'd at least stay open to that. I think that's a valid point. Although, we do have a plan in place for ultimately eliminating that now. Now, the question is whether we kick it up a notch when we can. Sort of like making that extra mortgage payment every year goes a long way. So I don't want to say no, but maybe we don't need to strike it out completely. I do think we need to have a plan for greatly reducing our reliance upon LGDF. I mean, there's at least, what, 2 bills pending right now? They're threatening to take away good chunks of it. And we're not going to get it off. We're not going to get off of it anytime soon, but it's also something to strive for. I want to be careful that we don't suggest that we don't need it anymore, and therefore just begging for the inevitable outcome, because that's not the case, and we won't go back to the historic basis for it and why it's an entitlement for municipalities as a trade-off back in the 1970s. But that is, I think that is something worth doing. And however we word it, whether it's aligning expenses with revenues, some concept of aligning expenses with revenues and community expectations is probably what you're getting at. It's not always maintaining and enhancing, but we should always be realigning what services we provide to what the environment is and what the expectations of the electorate are. Constituents. It's a broader pool than electorate. And now this is way for the future, but just because I'm going to put it on the table when the time comes, is we need to make some decision about what we're doing with the Community Grants Commission and the Community Grants Program. We eliminated the dollars, but we still have the commission and the infrastructure hanging around.
You know, Mayor, you
If that's not going to be, if that's not something that's going to be in alignment with the expectations of the community, then I think we ought to make that decision, not leave it laying around like a trilobite fossil.
I don't know how you worded it, but you said, you know, I'm sorry, I forgot exactly, but it struck a chord with me about dealing with the transportation fund, and like, you know, if we have a little extra money, should we pay down the mortgage early, kind of a thing. And that's what I would, you said it better than I did, even though I'm not remembering it. That's what I was trying to encourage everybody is, the question, there's some suggested possible uses here, but the question will probably come and go from year to year. You know, when we have a situation where we're in this condition, what, do we want to make a policy on how we do with it, or do we want to always have sort of an open-ended question? I suspect probably it's the latter, but the idea that that money is, it's every dollar we take, as we know, is way more than spoken for. And so that's just reality. So when we're talking about what can we use it for, to give you just an example, is if you said you were going to use it to bolster the downtown TIF, well, what you also might be saying then is your community expectations about redevelopment pace and quality, you were putting yourself in a better condition to meet those needs, for instance. That might be a better use than an accounting cleanup on a transportation fund. So those are the kinds of things that are in my head about that transportation fund, and to the broader point of what might we do with it to further the community's expectations beyond just that.
Right, and this goes to your other question about inviting other thoughts and comments, if not today, then at the next meeting. Are there other things that we haven't been able to kickstart that are new expectations in alignment with the community that we might have an opportunity to kickstart something we haven't been able to do before? I don't know, but I think that's a fair question. The only issue on the transportation fund is if it's really an accounting issue, that we do have a plan in place, and whether we accelerate the plan to eliminate that or not is the question. If it's doing some real harm, and I'm going to channel Commissioner Durkin here for a moment, if it's doing any real harm to our bond rating, then that obviously would be a goal we want to, that is something we want to maintain and enhance, clearly.
Obviously, we achieved the AAA with this situation.
Right, well, I think that was what Commissioner Barnett was saying, is that notwithstanding that, we still were able to achieve it, but if it were to come to a situation where it posed a threat to that, that might be a different analysis. But I think, I'm intrigued by I'll stop talking in a second.
No,
I'm intrigued by the concept of having default guidelines, are probably a poor choice of words, but you know, it's sort of what you do at the end of the year. You true up your household budget, and if you have some funds left, you have 3 or 4 things that you would sort of do with that money unless there was something else. So if you had the money, you make an extra payment on the mortgage, putting yourself that much further ahead down the road. But that assumes that the furnace didn't go bad on you. Or something else that would take priority. Kind of depends.
Now, as I was wiggling my pen, I was formulating exactly one of the things you started talking about is what is the incremental benefit in terms of our AAA rating to eliminating the $1.9 million transportation fund, and how does that relate to, well, could we take a bigger chunk out of the risk fund or the downtown TIF, and what is the benefit of that? So obviously, we're not going to call Standard & Poor's up and say, hey, what's going on? But if you guys could give us an idea of which ends up benefiting the AAA rating more, that would be a very helpful piece of information.
Is it a fair assumption that, I probably should know this from having read it, but I read them and I pop them out of my head. The downtown TIF, in particular, because of the dent that it carries, or that it's servicing, and it plays a role in that credit rating.
Yes, it does.
It's debt burden that at least at this point is marginally covered.
Right, and the key thing you're going to hear next week when Mike presents, or next month when Mike presents that, is how big of an issue is it and what backs it. And one of the reasons that it's not negatively affecting us here is that it's a general obligation bond, which means that if we have the capacity and could tax on the property tax levy for it. But yes, you were absolutely correct. It's already considered, that issue's documented. When the rating agencies look at us, they look at future debt service payments that are on the books already. Yes, already considered.
Can I just throw in a heads up to Mike when he talks about the downtown TIF debt service, and I'm still hung up on this notion that is there a way to rework that? You know, we're not just looking at making an extra payment on it, but is there a way to refinance or extend, or are there other options that we can explore that don't have a cost element to them that will improve that situation, maybe capture a better timeline in terms of economic development in the town? I know there's all kinds of obstacles to that, but I don't want to give up exploring that.
And I think we meet with our financial advisor tomorrow.
All right.
On that very issue. So.
And likewise on the risk fund too. I know we do a lot of terrific things, and we've done a lot of things over the last 10 years to really improve the risk part of the risk fund. But again, when we get to it, I'd like to hear more about not just how do we put more money into it, but how do we make that pot smaller necessarily so we don't have to fill it up so much?
To that point, too, about the TIF fund and how it plays into the facilities planning and what incremental change there may be with this property, too. How does that play into that conversation going into the future of the debt service of the existing TIF? I know I used incremental on purpose because it's small, but if that plays into some potential option with the financial guys, that adding a new increment to the tax increment financing district, does that allow us to rearrange in a different way, and then does that play into the decision for the facility setup of what we may want to look at for the options?
Concept we talked about in facilities planning and with more meat on the bone really there. Yes, we'll be ready to talk about that next month as well.
Thinking about the risk fund as well, I'd be interested to know how much of what we're looking at in the risk fund is actually that we have a liquidated amount, how much of it is cash.
We'll have all that information. Actually, we'll have all that information in about 2 weeks. We'll have every one of these questions framed up, answered, and all the trend lines ready to go.
Other preliminary comments? Heads up to
I
you.
was more just a listener than, didn't really have comments prepared and stuff.
No need. Just want to make sure everybody had the opportunity. Is there more to present?
No, we just wanted to go through a frame up of what you can expect and celebrate some of the great news and performance in our general fund.
Did you just say celebrate great news?
I did.
You tee that up for me, because we've been doing a lot of that, but not as much as we should. I think this village, and tonight, is another great example. Mayor Kelly told us about being the second best community in the world for kids, but
Awesomeness.
Yeah.
Second most awesome.
Wasn't it?
Second most awesomeness.
I like those
I thought there was a
adjectives.
super.
Don, I think you spell that correctly, maybe?
You're not at the spelling bee anymore.
Where we are right now compared to where we were when I was first brought into this council, and even in the 5 years ago, or whatever you want to call it, however many years ago, the way and the path that we're taking and the long-range planning that we're undertaking is so much different from where we were before. And it allows us to have these conversations that celebrate the good news, but also allow us to make good policy decisions that have been working. We wouldn't be at this position had the previous long-range planning sessions been put into place, acted upon, and then carried through. So, you know, it is a little bit of a rah-rah moment, but I think we need to do that so everybody realizes that these are important. While this one seemed a little bit more informational, it's very important that these are the building blocks of the next step, and the next step after that, and the next meeting after that, because it all goes together. And it's now carried over for how many years? And that's a testament to the folks that are here at 801 every day, following through with the policies that we have designed and designated for our community. So these are great meetings. I'm really happy to be here and be part of them, because it allows us to do, as Bob said, you know, come up with a plan long-term that'll outlive probably most of us, but to have a discussion now that can be carried through with our professional staff into the future. Those are really, really important conversations to have that will continue to allow Downers Grove to thrive and be a great community that it is, and win all these wonderful awards. Because if we didn't have, you know, I'm not going to say the long-range plan got us the second awesomest community in the world, but it allowed us as a village, one part of the community, to position ourselves in a way that is appropriate to our community members, and in this case to our kids. So think about that. What we're doing here is planning for the future for hopefully the kids of this town that are going to want to come back here and live or stay like I did. So, sorry, that was a little bit of a off-topic run at some good news, but
No?
sometimes we need that.
You really hit on a different issue, and that's goes back to community expectations and alignment with them. Is what are the metrics that we're trying to achieve? Now, is it that bar chart, or is it low crime rate, good parks, high, you know, well-educated, you know, good school system and things like that? You know, people liking their services. One of the factors was the pedestrian and bikeway and the green awards and things like that. I mean, what is it you're trying to achieve? That's where it gets back to what the community and alignment with community expectations are. It's not lines in a graph. It's what is it you're trying to achieve, and the long-range plan is a tool to get to those metrics that you're trying to measure your awesomeness against. And on that note, while everyone's contemplating other great new words, any questions from our two members of the audience? Dr. Goodman?
I had a couple questions. I was wondering, how does the target balance 38% of expenses that Standard & Poor's is looking at compare with our current council policy about fund balances?
They're almost identical.
And how, originally, a couple of years ago, there was a discussion about whether we wanted to change the way we figured the fund balance. I wondered how that discussion was going.
Well, we found that our current policy is a cash balance policy, and it subtracts this and adds this and does all these great things, and it makes a lot of sense to financially minded people. Then a couple of years ago, we came up with a rule of thumb that we thought was close to our policy, and we said 40% of expenses would be a good fund balance policy, and then lo and behold, S&P comes out and says 38.8% or something like that. So all of those indicators are in the same ballpark. And so really this sort of rule of thumb plus our standardized cash balance policy has served us well, and unless the council would like to change it or codify it or modify it, we're quite happy with S&P or 40% or our current official policy.
So do you still do this juggling of cash at the end of the year to figure out what your fund balance is, or do you actually use the fund balance at the end of the year?
Judy and her team actually calculates the cash balance to look at our cash balance policy, and then people like me or Mike do the quick fund balance to expenses, and we come at it from both ways.
And but Standard & Poor's analysis is based on what you and Mike do, the fund balance.
It's a little closer to the fund balance approach than the cash balance approach, but they are so interrelated. They both serve a purpose, and they both serve us well.
It makes it kind of complex for people outside of the village government to understand what you're doing, though.
Yeah, that's why I like the 40% of annual
Right.
expenses.
I was hoping that when you present these things in public, you would decide on one of them, and the cash balance with all the subtractions of numbers that have a little bit of judgment associated with them didn't seem as productive to me as the fund balance analysis. So I'm hoping the village is moving in that direction for its public display at any rate, and maybe the policy could move in that direction too. My other question is about participation of people like Tom and me, and maybe some others who would want to contribute discussions, again, particularly on this issue of aligning the village services and the village residents' expectations. It's great that we have elected representatives, and you're going to be the final deciders about this, but I'm hoping that there's going to be, in these series of meetings, some opportunity for people to talk about particularly some of the action items where you had eliminated various services that people had previously looked to the village for. And now that you're beginning to look at a good income and surplus over the expenses because of your wise management and ability to look forward, I'm hoping that some of these expected services can be, well, you can ask people if they still expect them or whether they think they're getting their services adequately somewhere else. But I didn't see anything in the discussion that Dave gave about the procedure for the long-range plan where he mentioned an opportunity or an expectation that people would come to you and talk about things like that.
For a question, I heard, maybe it's just because council speak has now become a second language for me, but I heard that that's next meeting, that the council members are going to be identifying, actually a couple we already did tonight, but the next meeting is where those kinds of conversations will come up, suggestions will come up from the vantage point of the council members. But I think your question, and more importantly, is how do we communicate that to the public so they know which meeting to show up to and share those things? And it sounds to me like it's the June 17th meeting.
Yeah, all the next three meetings.
I mean, any of them can be opportunities for that, but is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, as well as email tomorrow, phone call the Wednesday after that.
Some of our public are more bashful than I, and they
That's
might need a little more encouragement than I do.
Direct message on Twitter, whatever works.
And so I know the village has a very good outreach program. I don't think you need to make these emergency phone calls to all the village homes to alert them to the budget meetings, but I think you have to do a little bit more than you did
Watch out.
for the current meeting in order to encourage participation. And particularly if you can explain to people that this budget picture looks much better than it did before, and therefore the village is in a position to look again at some of the restrictions that were necessary during the Great Recession. And that is a topic that is current with the village. And the next 3 long-range planning meetings might be opportunities to discuss that.
Definitely. I think every long-range planning meeting is an opportunity to discuss that. I think the real question, it goes back to one of alignment with expectations. And not just because there's a list of things that were cut, do we now then go back to just putting them back because some extra dollars? I think we need to look at the experience of, now that we've had X number of years without them, what have we learned? In some instances, I think we'll find, as you mentioned, that it's being provided in some other way other than the village. And that can happen, that can come in various flavors of ice cream. And that may be a situation where, well, that's still happening. Nature found a way, and there it is. Other things may not have happened because of the absence of the village from that space. And then the question becomes, is that something that is in alignment with what the community expects the village to be present in? Now we have the experience of knowing from some passage of time, what it's like without it, what it's like with it. Can have that conversation.
We have other facility needs that haven't been addressed, the performance center, community auditorium, things like this that have been talked about in the past.
Right. And are there other paths by which to achieve that, such as through economic development and
Right.
other partnerships?
We have a strong economic development program now. Maybe we'll be able to do these things in a partnership. But those are topics that I think are associated with the long-range plan for the village. It's not so much an economic plan
Yeah.
for the village government, but a long-range plan for the village. Something like we did in TCD 3. And some of those things may be topics you want to examine again, maybe not through this long-range economic plan, but maybe you do want to put in some sort of participatory planning in the community over the next 5-10 years.
Sure, sure. And
There have
certainly
been a
there's-
lot of changes in the internet. There have been a lot of changes in our understanding of the climate, of what severe storms can do to a community. You have this action by the insurance companies now to try to hold governments responsible for acts of nature. It's a whole new world out there, and I'm saying that this sort of a discussion before you looking into the future is one where these topics ought to be raised. You have to keep your focus on finally coming out with an economic plan, but in the course of discussing what that economic plan is, you can also come up with some other options for the village to pursue in order to, as you say, match expectations with village services, or vice versa.
I knew exactly what you meant.
Mhm.
Thank you. Tom?
I keep hearing the same phrase, community expectations. Do we know what the community expectations are? For example, the people I talk to, the biggest item is taxes, real estate taxes. Any way to give us a little break here? That would reward us for doing whatever. But how do we get to knowing what the community expectations are? I think some years ago we did a survey. We've done the number 3, TCD 3. We did the other ones. Is it about time to do that again? Since there's perhaps some opportunities, like Gordon says, or maybe other people want to tune in on. Getting to what the community expectations are. Do any of you or all of you know exactly what they are? Is there something we should be doing in this time frame to find that out so that that's important?
I think some of that's a fair question. I think some of that's done at some level all the time. I think there are peaks and valleys when there's more of it than other times. There's one tool out
Tonight,
there.
here's a meeting of.
Well, right now,
You could argue
right now the
much-
two of you are the expectations of the community.
Why isn't there more people?
Oh, it's probably because there's golf ball sized hail outside, but
Well, it wasn't when we came.
I know, I'm just kidding. But no, you raise a good point, and we're always trying to figure out new ways to get that kind of input, and we do it through some rather labor-intensive and expensive ways periodically. We try not to do that too often because they're labor-intensive and expensive. And then there are more day-to-day routine ways, and obviously all of us are out there, and we hear from people sharing their opinions. I've not found this town to ever be shy about expressing their views on subjects.
Showed up at coffee with the council.
They find a way to get to you. It's not a problem. But then there's even tools. I think I shared one with Manager Fieldman that I saw demonstrated at National League of Cities last time I was there, where literally there's this. I won't go into a lot of detail, take up everyone's time. It's raining. You're not going anywhere. Where basically you let every citizen get online with what your general fund is, and using little slider scale choices, sort of set how important different things are to you. But you only have so much money, and so the citizen has to say, well, I want this, and I want that, and I want this. And pretty soon they start to bump up against, well, you don't have that much, so you're going to have to start making choices. And it allows everybody to sort of on a micro level participate in the same kind of decisions that have to be made in the macro level all the time. Some people are frightened to see those results, other people embrace them. Some communities have them on their website, and it's a real educational tool because it allows people to walk through some of the very decisions that we're having and realizing, well, you know, I want this, but if I have this, I can't have all this, and what do I do? And if the choice is in order to get all of it, I have to raise taxes, well, then you find out what the expectations of the community are. But it's a fair point, and I think it's something that all municipalities have to continually strive to do as well as they can. And I don't mean to monopolize the conversation,
We
please.
certainly have a track record of, you know, actively and proactively seeking that kind of input from
Can
residents.
you talk a little louder, please?
I'm sorry. We certainly have a track record of actively and proactively both seeking that kind of input from residents. And the interim periods between those more pronounced methods and the more consistent methods are, they vary in time. But one thing I just wanted to add to this conversation for this evening is some of this, whether you're operating sliders on a modeling thing or you're wishing that we could build a fine arts center, is sort of sounds a little bit presumptive about our financial condition. We have a much stronger general fund financial cash position than we had 6 years ago. We also got a list, though, as long as our arm, about stuff we're not doing that are basic to the operation of the village, whether they're police stations, village halls, streets. Run down the list. It's sidewalks,
Curb and gutter.
available cash for economic development initiatives that come forward to us. The list, in this moment tonight, we have a great cash position and we have some good news to tell. But it's so far away from some sort of we've solved our problems and now have extra money. If we have extra money, I suggest we ought to be giving it back. We don't. And we're a million miles away from having extra money. So I just would caution I'm going to rain on Jeff's second best awesomeness conversation about celebrating good news, because there is a lot of good news about a lot of good actions by village staff over the last 5 years. But we're a million miles away from being some sort of fat, dumb, and happy with a lot of money coming out of our ears kind of condition. We've got tons of huge, major capital needs. We have a continuing trend of personnel and pension-related costs that is not doing anything but heading north. And so I would suggest that any conversations about what other kinds of cool things might we do is way the heck premature.
Right, well, and that assumes that it's other, additional cool things, could be different things. And to your point,
To the point about
might decide we don't need landlines anymore,
Yeah,
we're gonna go
right.
do cell phones.
Fair enough.
But, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I don't want for the two of you, I don't want you to get the impression that we just have big bags of money.
Well,
Look at it.
and the risk in the community, I mean, certainly there's some history to go on from, 10 years ago relative to the Park District. There is certainly a risk that our messaging gets somehow skewed or taken in a vacuum, looking at a fund balance on a piece of paper.
Right.
We're supposed to have 38.8 or 40%, and all of a sudden we've got 46.5 or whatever it is. Well, shoot, let's just give all the money back. That's such a untotal vocabulary breakdown here, but that's so not the whole picture. And it's important that we're really clear about that in our conversations.
Nope,
and
I agree.
communications.
Yeah, and it's all perspective. I mean, I was looking at it similarly to what you were saying, and I was thinking, boy, we have a fund balance, but we have a lot of work to do. And Gordon was looking at it like, hey, this is great, let's tell everyone to come with their list. So, and then Tom was saying, hey, give us back our money, and use it. So it's all the way everyone looks at it and their perspective, and it's important to think about
there's
that.
another thing that could consider funny, but, we've achieved some of these results by holding down staff. How long are we gonna be able to do that? If you're gonna provide more services, you need more staff. If we replace these buildings and we can do more, like I say, I think building permits is probably on the increase. I know when I had some work done in my house, it took me 3 weeks to do. That's, that isn't even the goal for them, but they got there. So I think that's maybe the 400-pound gorilla in the room, that, yeah, sooner or later, we're gonna have to add some staff, be realistic.
Any other thoughts, comments, philosophies, poetic observations?
I'm ready for the next meeting.
All right.